20,000 feet above the German city of Bremen, Staff Sergeant Eugene Moran could feel the tail section of his B-17 flying fortress shuddering violently as cannon shells and machine gun bullets tore through the aluminum skin around him. It was November 29th, 1943, and for the past several minutes, waves of German fighters had been converging on his crippled bomber like sharks circling wounded prey. The Messerschmitt Bf-1 09 IS and Focke-Wulf 1-9 OS came at them from every angle imaginable, their guns spitting tracers that looked like angry fireflies streaking through the freezing air. Moran's twin 50 caliber machine guns were hot to the touch, even in the 50 degrees below zero cold. He'd been firing almost continuously, tracking targets, leading shots, squeezing the triggers in controlled bursts. His steel chest plate protected his torso, but his forearms were already bleeding from shrapnel wounds. His parachute, hanging on the wall behind him, had been shredded by German 20mm cannon rounds. And then came the explosion that changed everything. The B-17 flying fortress, designated as Rikki Tikki Tavi, named after the fearless mongoose from Rudyard Kipling's Jungle Book, lurched violently as a German flak shell found its mark. The 12-foot tail section, with Moran still inside it, separated from the rest of the aircraft with a sound like the world tearing in half. The engines faded to silence. The intercom went dead. The air pressure changed dramatically. Eugene Moran, 19 years old, a farm boy from Wisconsin who'd enlisted the day he turned 18, suddenly found himself in a situation that defied survival. He was trapped in a severed tail section, falling through 4 miles of sky, with no parachute, no way out, and German fighters still hunting him. Most men would have simply waited for death. Eugene Moran kept shooting. The story of how Eugene Moran survived one of the most improbable ordeals in aviation history begins not in the frozen skies over Germany, but in the rugged ridge and valley country of southwestern Wisconsin. He was born in 1924 on a small dairy farm a few miles south of Soldiers Grove in the Kickapoo Valley. It was a landscape of rolling hills, dense forests, and narrow valleys where fog settled thick in the mornings and the winters were harsh enough to test anyone's resolve. The Moran farm was modest, the work endless. Dairy farming in that era meant rising before dawn, milking by hand, hauling feed, mucking stalls, repairing fences, and doing it all again the next day. It was the kind of life that built strong backs and hard hands. But for young Gene Moran, it also built a fierce desire to see something beyond the next ridge. Gene remembered one particular afternoon when he was supposed to bring the cows in for milking. He was late, and his father was angry about it. But Gene had a good reason for his tardiness. He'd seen an airplane flying over the Kickapoo Valley, a rare sight in those days, and he'd chased after it through the fields, waving his arms desperately until the pilot waved back. "Someday I'm going to be up there," he told anyone who would listen. His mother probably wished he'd been less enthusiastic about that particular dream. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, 17-year-old Eugene Moran saw it as his ticket out of shoveling cow manure and endless farm chores. He desperately wanted to join the service immediately, but he needed his parents' permission. His mother did everything in her power to keep the boy out of the war, arguing that serving his country as a farmer was a perfectly acceptable alternative to getting killed on a battlefield thousands of miles from home. She made him wait, using every argument she could muster, every delay tactic available. But the day Eugene Moran turned 18 in July of 1942, he was at the Army Air Corps recruiting station in Madison. His mother's objections were overruled by his determination. He raised his right hand and swore the oath. Within weeks, he was gone from the farm, swept into the great machine of wartime training that was churning out hundreds of thousands of young men and transforming them into warriors. For Gene, the journey from farm boy to combat airman took him through a succession of training bases scattered across the American heartland. He learned to march, to salute, to follow orders without question. He learned aircraft recognition, gunnery, emergency procedures. He learned how to strip and reassemble a Browning M250 caliber machine gun blindfolded. He learned how to lead a target traveling at 300 miles per hour while sitting in a freezing metal tube at 25,000 feet. And he learned that out of all the positions on a B-17 bomber crew, he was being trained for one of the most dangerous, tail gunner. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress was a marvel of American engineering and industrial might. It was a 4-engine heavy bomber designed to carry up to 8,000 pounds of high explosive bombs deep into enemy territory, deliver its payload, and bring its 10-man crew home safely. The aircraft stretched 74 feet from nose to tail and had a wingspan of over 100 feet. 4 Wright Cyclone radial engines, each producing over 1,000 horsepower, pushed the bomber to speeds approaching 300 miles per hour. But what made the B-17 truly distinctive was its defensive armament. The Germans called it the porcupine because it bristled with 1350 caliber machine guns positioned at 9 different locations throughout the aircraft. There were guns in the nose, in the top turret, in the ball turret underneath, at the waist positions on both sides, and most critically, in the tail. The tail gunner position was simultaneously the most important and most dangerous job on the aircraft. When German fighters attacked American bomber formations, their preferred tactic was to come in from behind and below, positioning themselves in the blind spots where the bombers' defensive guns couldn't easily track them. The tail gunner was the last line of defense against these attacks. He sat on a bicycle seat at the very rear of the aircraft, leaning into a curved steel chest plate that provided minimal protection against incoming fire. Behind him was a small plexiglass window and his 2 50 caliber machine guns, which could traverse about 90 degrees side to side and elevate or depress to cover the entire rear quarter of the sky. It was cramped, cold, isolated, and utterly exposed. The tail was connected to the main fuselage by a narrow walkway over the tail wheel assembly. Once the tail gunner crawled back to his position and settled in, he was effectively sealed off from the rest of the crew. The intercom was his only connection to the other 9 men in the aircraft. He couldn't see them, couldn't reach them. If the aircraft was hit and started going down, he had to crawl back through that narrow passage, grab his parachute from where it hung on a nearby wall. There wasn't room to wear it at the gun position, strap it on, and then bail out through the waist gunner section, all while the aircraft might be spinning, burning, or breaking apart. Eugene Moran completed his training in early 1943 and was promoted to staff sergeant. He received his orders: report to the 96th Bombardment Group, 339th Bombardment Squadron, 8th Air Force. In October of 1943, at age 19, he sailed across the Atlantic and arrived at RAF Snetterton Heath, a bomber base in Norfolk, England. The base was a sprawling complex of runways, hardstands, Nissen huts, and mud. Endless mud that turned every walk across the base into a slog. The men lived in cramped huts, heated by small stoves that did little to cut the damp English chill. They ate powdered eggs and Spam for breakfast, attended briefings where intelligence officers pointed at maps of Germany and described the targets they'd be bombing. And they waited. They waited to fly, waited to fight, waited to discover whether they'd be among the lucky ones who completed their 25-mission combat tour and went home, or among the statistics. Gene was assigned to the crew of a B-17F, serial number 42-30177, which the crew had christened Rikki Tikki Tavi, after the fearless mongoose from Kipling's story. The name was painted on the nose along with some artwork. The aircraft commander was First Lieutenant Linwood Langley, a young pilot shouldering the enormous responsibility of keeping 10 men alive in the most dangerous skies in the world. The crew bonded quickly, as bomber crews did. They had to. Their lives depended on each other in the most literal sense possible. The pilot and co-pilot flying the aircraft, the navigator plotting the course, the bombardier aiming the bombs, the engineer monitoring the engines, the radio operator maintaining communications, the gunners protecting the aircraft from enemy fighters. 10 men, each with a specific job, all essential. Eugene Moran's job was to keep enemy fighters from shooting them down from behind. Their first mission was nerve-wracking but successful. Then a second, then a third. By their fourth mission, they were starting to feel like veterans. Though every man who'd been flying combat for any length of time knew that confidence could be the most dangerous thing of all. The 8th Air Force's daylight bombing campaign against Germany was proving far more costly than anyone had anticipated. The pre-war theory had been that heavily armed bomber formations could fight their way to any target, deliver their bombs, and fight their way home without fighter escort. The reality was proving that theory catastrophically wrong. German fighters were shooting down bombers at an unsustainable rate. On some missions, 10% of the attacking force failed to return. On the worst missions, the losses climbed to 20% or higher. The crews lived with mathematics. 25 missions to complete a combat tour. If 10% were lost on each mission, the mathematical probability of surviving 25 missions was essentially zero. They knew this. They flew anyway. On the morning of November 29, 1943, over 300 bomber crewmen across multiple bases in England were awakened in the pre-dawn darkness. They stumbled out of their bunks, threw on their uniforms, and made their way through the cold and dark to the mess halls, where they consumed what might be their last breakfast. Then came the briefing. The intelligence officers pulled back the curtain covering the large map on the wall, and a collective groan went through the room. The target for today's mission, Bremen, Germany. Bremen was one of the most heavily defended industrial cities in Germany. It had shipyards building U-boats, factories producing Focke-Wulf fighter aircraft, and enough anti-aircraft artillery to fill the sky with deadly black puffs of exploding steel. The Luftwaffe knew the Americans would keep coming back to Bremen, and they positioned squadrons of their best fighters to defend it. For the crews assembled in that briefing room, Bremen meant a tough mission. Some of them would not be coming back. The briefing officer explained the route, the target, the expected opposition, the escape procedures if they were shot down. The crews absorbed the information with the grim professionalism of men who'd done this before. Then they gathered their gear, heavy fleece-lined leather flight suits, oxygen masks, parachutes, flak vests, and headed to the hard stands where their aircraft waited. Eugene Moran climbed aboard Rikki-Tikki-Tavi through the waist gunner door and made his way through the cramped interior to the tail. He settled into his bicycle seat, adjusted his oxygen mask, checked his guns, and waited for the engines to start. The Wright Cyclones coughed to life one by one, their combined roar building until conversation was impossible. The bomber taxied out of its hard stand and joined the long line of B-17s rolling toward the runway. When their turn came, Lieutenant Langley pushed the throttles forward, and the 50,000-pound aircraft accelerated down the runway, bouncing and shaking until the wheels left the ground and they were airborne. Climbing, always climbing, the bombers spiraled upward, forming into their defensive box formation. Squadron by squadron, group by group, the massive aerial armada assembled over England. It took hours to get everyone into position, burning precious fuel, but the formation was essential to survival. Lone bombers were easy kills. Bombers in tight formation presented overlapping fields of fire that made attacking them far more dangerous for enemy fighters. By the time over 300 B-17 EKS were formed up and heading across the North Sea toward Germany, it was late morning. Eugene Moran watched England disappear behind them. The North Sea spread out below, gray and cold and inhospitable. If they had to ditch in that water, survival time would be measured in minutes. Then the coast of occupied Europe appeared ahead, and the tension in every aircraft ratcheted up several notches. They crossed the coastline, and immediately the sky around them began to fill with black puffs of exploding anti-aircraft shells. The German gunners on the ground were firing in massed batteries, trying to predict where the bomber formation would be and filling that space with deadly steel fragments. The shells exploded with sharp cracks that you could hear even over the roar of the engines. Fragments would ring against the aluminum skin of the aircraft. A close burst could knock out an engine, kill a crew member, or send a bomber tumbling from the sky. The pilots couldn't take evasive action. They had to hold their heading and altitude to stay in formation and reach the bombing point. All they could do was fly straight through the flak field and hope their luck held. And then the fighters arrived. The German fighter pilots had been studying American bomber tactics for months, and they'd developed attacks specifically designed to maximize damage while minimizing their exposure to defensive fire. The Messerschmitt Bf-100s came first, twin-engine heavy fighters armed with rockets. They'd position themselves ahead of the bomber formation and fire their 21-centimeter rockets from outside machine gun range. The rockets streaked toward the bombers, trailing smoke, and when they hit, the explosions were devastating. A single rocket hit could blow a B-17 in half. The 100s fired their rockets and then peeled away, making room for the single-engine fighters to press home their attacks. The Messerschmitt F-109S and Focke-Wulf F-1900S came in waves, attacking from every angle. Some came head-on, diving through the formation with their guns blazing. Others came from the sides, from above, from below. The sky became a chaotic swirl of tracers, explosions, falling bombers, and parachutes blossoming as crewmen abandoned stricken aircraft. Eugene Moran's world narrowed to his gun sights and the section of sky he was responsible for defending. He tracked the German fighters as they made their passes, leading his aim, squeezing off bursts when he had a shot. The .50 caliber machine guns hammered away, brass shell casings cascading onto the floor around his feet. He watched German fighters flash past, so close he could see the pilots' faces. He saw bombers ahead of them take hits and fall out of formation, trailing smoke and flame. He saw parachutes, some with men hanging beneath them, others empty and streaming, the men having been killed before they could escape. And through it all, Rikki-Tikki-Tavi kept flying, kept holding position, kept pushing toward the target. Bremen was still miles ahead, and they had to reach it, drop their bombs, and then run the same gauntlet all the way back to England. The bombardier, Donald Curtis, called out, "Bombs away," over the intercom, and the aircraft lurched upward as 10 500-pound bombs fell toward the city below. Their job was done. Now they just had to survive long enough to get home. Lieutenant Langley brought the bomber around, following the formation as they turned west and headed back toward the coast. For a brief moment, there was a sense of relief. They'd done it. They'd hit the target, and they were still flying. But that relief lasted only seconds before the German fighters came back with renewed fury. And this time, Rikki-Tikki-Tavi started falling behind the formation. It might have been battle damage to an engine. It might have been fuel system problems. Whatever the cause, the B-17 began losing speed, unable to keep up with the other bombers. And in the sky over Germany in 1943, a lone bomber was a dead bomber. The German fighter pilots saw the straggler and converged on it like wolves cutting a wounded animal from the herd. They came at Rikki-Tikki-Tavi from every direction, no longer having to worry about fire from other bombers in the formation. The attacks intensified to a level that seemed impossible to survive. Eugene Moran fired his guns until the barrels were so hot they glowed. He called out targets over the intercom. Fighter, 6 o'clock low. Fighter, 6 o'clock high. The other gunners were calling out their own sightings, the intercom a chaos of urgent voices. And then those voices started to go silent. The waist gunners were hit. The ball turret gunner was hit. The top turret gunner stopped responding. Gene couldn't see what was happening in the rest of the aircraft, but he could tell from the silence on the intercom that his crewmates were dying. Cannon shells tore through the thin aluminum skin of the bomber, 20mm and 30mm. Rounds designed to destroy aircraft found their marks. Gene felt impacts all around him. Something hot seared through his left forearm, then his right. Blood began soaking into his flight suit, but the extreme cold at altitude meant the bleeding was minimal. His arms still worked. He could still fire his guns. Behind him, he heard something tear and felt a rush of air. He glanced back and saw that his parachute hanging on its hook had been shredded by cannon fire. The silk was in tatters. It was useless. If he had to bail out now, he'd have no way to slow his fall. That thought was still registering when a Messerschmitt Bf-109 pulled alongside the tail, close enough that Gene could see the pilot clearly. The German was gesturing, making hand signals. He was telling Gene to bail out, to abandon the doomed bomber while he still could. It was a rare moment of humanity in the midst of mechanized slaughter. But before Gene could even consider the offer, one of his surviving crewmates opened fire on the German fighter, and it peeled away. The attacks continued. Gene's guns jammed. He worked frantically to clear the jam, his wounded arms screaming in protest. He got one gun working again and resumed firing. The German fighters were relentless. They'd been fighting American bombers long enough to know how to finish off a crippled aircraft. They concentrated their fire on critical areas. The wings where the fuel tanks were, the cockpit where the pilot sat, the engines, the tail section where the control surfaces were. Gene felt the entire tail section shuddering under repeated impacts. Bullets punched through the aluminum everywhere he looked. Something slammed into his chest, stopped by the steel plate he was leaning against, but the impact broke several ribs. He gasped for breath, fighting to stay conscious. And then came the hit that ended everything. A German flak shell, possibly an 88mm round from anti-aircraft guns, still firing from the ground, struck Rikki-Tikki-Tavi somewhere near the radio room section of the fuselage. The explosion was catastrophic. the 12-foot tail section from just forward of the vertical stabilizer all the way back, separated from the rest of the aircraft. One moment, Eugene Moran was part of a 10-man crew fighting desperately to keep their bomber in the air. The next moment, he was alone in a severed piece of aircraft falling through 20,000 feet of sky with nothing beneath him but German territory. The sound of the engines faded rapidly as the forward section of the bomber tumbled away in a different direction. The intercom went dead. The change in air pressure was immediate and dramatic. Gene's ears popped painfully. He tried to stand, tried to reach the small escape hatch, but he couldn't move. The centrifugal force of the spinning tail section pinned him against his seat. His first thought was to grab his parachute, but when he looked back at where it hung, he saw the shredded silk and remembered it was useless anyway. His second thought was to try to force open the escape hatch. He managed to reach it, but it wouldn't budge. The air pressure, the spinning, something was keeping it sealed. He tried again with all his strength. Nothing. He was trapped. He was conscious of the fact that he was falling, accelerating toward the earth at terminal velocity, trapped in a metal coffin with no way out and no way to survive. Most people, faced with certain death, might simply close their eyes and wait for the end. Eugene Moran reached for his grandmother's rosary. She'd given it to him before he left for the war, a token of faith, a reminder of home. He pulled it from inside his flight suit and began running the beads through his fingers, praying with an intensity he'd never known. But something strange was happening. The tail section wasn't plummeting straight down like he'd expected. The horizontal stabilizers, the small wings at the back of the tail, were acting like the fins of a dart, creating drag and some degree of aerodynamic stability. Instead of tumbling wildly end over end, the tail was gliding downward, still spinning, but not falling as violently as it might have. The effect was to slow his descent. Instead of a 90-second plunge from 20,000 feet, Eugene Moran's fall would take between 10 and 15 minutes. 10 to 15 minutes to contemplate his own death. 10 to 15 minutes to watch the earth slowly grow larger below him. 10 to 15 minutes of absolute terror. But Eugene Moran wasn't just praying and waiting to die. The German fighters were still out there, and they'd seen this strange piece of wreckage spinning down. To them, it might have been something to investigate, something to shoot at for target practice. Eugene Moran still had one gun working. His ammunition belts were still feeding rounds. And he was still a tail gunner on a bomber, even if that bomber was now just a severed tail section falling out of the sky. When he saw German fighters approaching, he fired at them. The recoil from the gun caused the falling tail section to shift in the air, affecting its spin. But he kept shooting. He was going to fight until he hit the ground. The German flak batteries on the ground could see something falling, something that looked vaguely like an aircraft, but didn't match anything they recognized. They kept firing at it, sending up anti-aircraft shells that exploded around the falling tail section. The physical effects of the fall were becoming increasingly apparent. Eugene could feel his gold dental fillings starting to pop loose from his teeth due to the air pressure changes, and the vibration. They came out one by one, and he spit them out, watching them disappear into the rushing air. His wounded arms were going numb from blood loss and cold. His broken ribs ground against each other with every breath. He was conscious of passing through different layers of clouds, the temperature changing as he descended. He could see the earth below growing more distinct, going from a vague patchwork of browns and greens to recognizable fields and forests. He knew he was running out of altitude. The ground was coming up fast. He braced himself against his seat, pressed his back against the steel chest plate, and held on. The tail section fell through the canopy of a forest, the trees breaking and bending under the impact. The branches acted as a cushion, dissipating some of the energy, slowing the descent in stages rather than one catastrophic stop. The tail section came to rest at an angle, wedged between several large trees, about 3 feet above the forest floor. It had come down in a wooded area near the German town of Focke, just a few miles south of Bremen. For several long moments, Eugene Moran couldn't process what had just happened. He was alive. Against every law of physics and probability, he was alive. His body was broken, both forearms fractured, ribs broken, skull cracked, but he was breathing. He was conscious. He had survived a 4-mile fall without a parachute. But his ordeal was far from over. He could see light through gaps in the wreckage. He heard voices outside speaking in German. French workers who'd been laboring in a nearby field had seen the tail section come down and rushed to investigate. Behind them came German soldiers. Eugene tried to move and discovered that while his arms and torso were badly injured, nothing seemed to be completely non-functional. He managed to crawl toward the light, toward the voices. Hands reached in and pulled him out. He collapsed onto the forest floor, bleeding, dazed, but unbelievably alive. The German soldiers secured him, but they also called for medical help. Whether it was professional military courtesy or simple human decency in the face of a miracle or a desire to interrogate a captured airman, they treated his wounds enough to keep him alive and transported him to a prisoner of war camp. At the camp, Eugene Moran's survival depended on 2 Serbian doctors who were themselves prisoners. These men looked at the 19-year-old American boy with the crushed skull, broken bones, and shrapnel wounds, and they performed surgery with whatever tools and supplies they had available. They placed a metal plate over the section of Eugene's skull that had been shattered, covering his exposed brain. They set his broken arms. They treated his other wounds. The surgery was crude, performed without proper anesthesia or surgical equipment, but it saved his life. In the history of the war, historians believe that only 3 men survived falls from such extreme altitudes without parachutes. The stories of the other 2 are fragmentary, incomplete. The only detailed, full-length account belongs to Eugene Moran, and it's a story that almost defies belief. Over the course of the next 17 months, Eugene Moran experienced more kinds of hell than most people encounter in a lifetime. He was moved between different prisoner of war camps in Germany, Russia, and Poland as the Germans tried to stay ahead of the advancing Allied armies. The conditions in these camps ranged from merely miserable to absolutely deadly. Inadequate food, minimal medical care, brutal guards, and the constant uncertainty of whether the Germans would simply execute the prisoners rather than let them be liberated. Jean survived solitary confinement for infractions real and imagined. He survived disease. He survived the infamous Hell Ship transfer, crammed into cargo holds with hundreds of other prisoners, and in the final months of the war, as Germany collapsed and the camps had to be evacuated, he survived a 600-mile forced march between February and April of 1945. The march was a death sentence for many prisoners. The men were already weakened by months or years of malnutrition and poor treatment. Now they were forced to walk hundreds of miles in the dead of winter, with minimal food and no medical care. Men dropped dead by the side of the road. Others collapsed and were shot by guards who didn't want to deal with stragglers. Eugene Moran, who'd weighed a healthy 160 pounds when he'd enlisted, now weighed barely 128 pounds. His body was consuming itself just to keep functioning. But he kept walking, one foot in front of the other, mile after mile, day after day. And on April 26, 1945, near the town of Bitterfeld in Germany, the column of prisoners encountered a column of American tanks. The war for Eugene Moran was finally over. The Americans liberated him and the other prisoners, providing medical care, food, and transportation back to Allied lines. Eugene was eventually shipped back to the United States, arriving home to Wisconsin in time to see his family again and try to rebuild a life that had been put on hold for 3 years. He was awarded 2 Purple Hearts for his wounds, the Air Medal with Gold Leaf Cluster for his combat missions, the Good Conduct Medal, and the European Theater Award. The Army wanted to debrief him about his experiences, particularly the fall and survival. The story was so extraordinary that they needed it documented in detail. But Eugene Moran didn't want to talk about it. Not to the Army, not to reporters, not to anyone. He'd survived hell, and he wanted to leave it in the past. He married Peg Finley a few months after returning home. They built a life together, raising a family, trying to find normalcy after the abnormality of war. Eugene never spoke about November 29, 1943. When people would ask about his service, he'd give the minimum details necessary and change the subject. The medals stayed in a box, tucked away where they wouldn't be a daily reminder. The memories stayed locked in a part of his mind where they couldn't intrude on his present. For decades, the story of Eugene Moran's miraculous survival was known only to a few military records clerks and the men who'd debriefed him after the war. But in 2014, that changed. Eugene Moran died that year, 89 years old, having lived a full life far beyond what should have been possible on that November day in 1943. 8 years after his death, in 2022, author John Armbruster published a book titled Tailspin that told Gene's story in complete detail for the first time. Armbruster had interviewed Gene extensively in the final years of his life, drawing out the details of that day over Bremen, the fall, the survival, the captivity, the long road home. The book revealed a story that seemed too extraordinary to be true, and yet every detail was verified by military records, by eyewitness accounts, by the simple fact that Eugene Moran had survived when survival should have been impossible. The town of Soldiers Grove, Wisconsin, honored its native son by naming a street after him, Eugene P. Moran Park Drive. It's a small memorial, a street sign in a small town, but it represents recognition for a man who exemplified courage in its purest form. Think about what Eugene Moran did in those final moments before his bomber's tail section broke free. He was wounded, bleeding, his parachute destroyed, his crewmates dead or dying around him. He knew the aircraft was doomed. He knew he was almost certainly going to die. And when the tail section broke free, and he found himself falling through 4 miles of sky, trapped in a metal cage with no way out and no way to survive, he didn't simply give up and wait for the end. He kept fighting. He grabbed his guns, and when German fighters came close, he shot at them. He was going to go down fighting, defending his brothers in arms to the very last second. That's not just courage. That's something beyond courage. That's the kind of spirit that defines the greatest generation. And when he survived that impossible fall, when he endured 17 months as a prisoner of war, when he marched 600 miles while starving and wounded, when he finally made it home and had to somehow process all that trauma and grief and horror, he didn't ask for recognition. He didn't seek the spotlight. He just wanted to live his life, raise his family, and try to find some peace after surviving hell. The fact that his story remained largely unknown for 70 years is a testament to his humility. The fact that we know it now is a testament to the importance of preserving these histories before they're lost forever. Eugene Moran's story is one of thousands of extraordinary stories from World War II, stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things when faced with impossible situations. Every time we forget one of these stories, we lose a piece of our history, a piece of our heritage, a piece of the truth about what that generation endured so that we could live in freedom. Eugene Moran fell 4 miles from the sky and lived to tell about it, even though he chose not to tell for most of his life. But his story survived, and it needs to continue surviving. If this story moved you, if it made you think about courage and sacrifice and the incredible resilience of the human spirit, do me a favor. Hit that like button right now. Every single like tells the algorithm to show this story to more people who need to hear it. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications because we're rescuing forgotten stories like this from dusty archives every single day. These are real people, real heroes, real stories that deserve to be remembered. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Are you in the United States, Canada, the UK, Australia, somewhere else entirely? Our community stretches across the whole world, and every single one of you is part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Tell us if you've heard stories like Eugene Moran's before. Just let us know you're here, you're listening, and you're helping to make sure that men like Staff Sergeant Eugene Moran aren't forgotten. Thank you for watching, and thank you for being part of this mission to preserve history. These men deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that happen.